Emily and Ethan Johnson seemed like ordinary siblings in Maplewood, but behind the closed doors of their family's home, a dark and twisted secret was unraveling. A secret that would shatter their lives and expose a generational legacy of control, coercion, and betrayal. The Johnson family lived in Maplewood, a town that prided itself on its charm and community spirit. John and Sarah Johnson were well known in the neighborhood. John worked at the local hardware store, and Sarah was a part-time librarian, often seen recommending books to patrons with a warm smile. Their two children, Emily and Ethan, were typical kids in the eyes of the community. Emily, 16 years old, was admired for her artistic talent and academic achievements, while Ethan, her younger brother, was quiet and reserved, often trailing behind his sister wherever she went. The Johnsons' house was modest but well kept, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a bright red door that stood out in the row of similar suburban homes. Mrs. Callahan, their next-door neighbor, often complimented Sarah on her gardening skills, marveling at the vibrant roses that lined their front yard. It seemed to everyone that the Johnsons had built an idyllic life. As Emily neared her 16th birthday, subtle changes began to occur in the household. The family, once so friendly and open, started pulling back from the community. Sarah, who once volunteered for local events, declined invitations, citing vague excuses. John became quieter, often coming home from work and retreating to his study, locking the door behind him. Emily, too, seemed different. She stopped inviting friends over and spent more time alone in her room. The once lively household became eerily silent. Mrs. Callahan noticed these changes first. She was a keen observer, always keeping an eye on the comings and goings of her neighbors. She remarked to others in passing how unusual it was that Emily no longer joined her mother for their Sunday walks. Others in the neighborhood began to notice too, whispering about how the Johnsons had become more withdrawn. Some chalked it up to typical family troubles, while others speculated about financial strain or health issues. Emily felt the tension in her home every day. It started with small restrictions, her parents forbidding her from staying out past dark or declining her requests to visit friends. Then, the rules became stricter. She was no longer allowed to use her phone unsupervised, and her parents went through her messages, claiming it was for her safety. The once warm and loving atmosphere of the Johnson household turned cold, oppressive even. What troubled Emily most were the hushed conversations between her parents. Late at night, when she was supposed to be asleep, she would hear them talking in low, serious tones. She couldn't make out the words, but the urgency in their voices sent chills down her spine. She started to feel like she was living in a house filled with secrets, each one heavier than the last. Ethan, though younger, seemed to notice the changes too. He spent more time in his room, avoiding their parents and their increasingly strange behavior. Emily tried to comfort him, but she could barely manage her own growing unease. The siblings, once so close, started to drift apart under the weight of the tension surrounding them. Despite her fears, Emily didn't know where to turn. She thought about confiding in Mrs. Callahan, who had always been kind to her. But something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of making things worse, or the hope that whatever was happening would pass on its own. Instead, she kept quiet, burying her anxiety as best she could. The days turned into weeks, and the changes in her parents only deepened. Emily began to feel like a prisoner in her own home, her every move monitored, her every decision controlled. The once bright future she had envisioned for herself seemed to fade away, replaced by a growing sense of dread she couldn't quite explain. Unbeknownst to her, the truth behind her parents' behavior was darker than anything she could have imagined. Emily's life took a sharp turn one evening when she overheard a conversation that shattered her sense of reality. It was late, and she had been unable to sleep, her mind restless with the unease that had taken over her home. As she tiptoed down the hallway for a glass of water, her parents' voices caught her attention. They were speaking in low, tense whispers, the kind that immediately told Emily they didn't want to be overheard. She stopped in her tracks and pressed herself against the wall outside their bedroom door, straining to hear. At first, the words were muffled, but as she listened more intently, certain phrases began to stand out. "It's time," her father said, his tone firm but troubled. "We can't put it off any longer. She has to understand. It's what's best for all of us. Emily's heart began to race as she struggled to piece together the meaning behind his words. Her mother responded, her voice quieter but equally insistent. You know the family's expectations. This is our responsibility, John. It's not about what she wants. It's about tradition. Tradition. The word echoed in Emily's mind like a warning bell. Her family had always been peculiar about their history, often telling stories of their ancestors and the importance of preserving their lineage. But it was something they spoke of vaguely, never in detail, and Emily had never thought much of it. Now, however, the gravity of their words sent a chill down her spine. As the conversation continued, Emily began to understand the horrifying truth. Her parents were planning something unthinkable, a forced marriage between her and her younger brother, Ethan. The idea was so incomprehensible, so revolting, that Emily felt her knees weaken beneath her. She covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a gasp, her body trembling as the weight of the revelation sank in. Her parents spoke of the purity of their bloodline, a term Emily had heard before but never truly understood. They discussed the pressure from extended family members, some of whom she hadn't even met, to uphold this bizarre and archaic tradition. Emily realized with growing horror that she was nothing more than a pawn in a twisted game, a tool to fulfill their warped sense of duty. For the next several days, Emily lived in a state of constant fear. Every interaction with her parents felt tainted, their smiles laced with hidden agendas. She tried to act normal, fearing that any sign of resistance would only make things worse. At the same time, she was desperate to find a way out. She thought about telling someone, a teacher, a friend, maybe even Mrs. Callahan, but the risk felt too great. Her parents' control over her life was absolute, and she feared what they might do if they discovered her plan. Her relationship with Ethan became strained as well. Though he remained his quiet, withdrawn self, Emily couldn't bring herself to look at him without feeling a mix of anger and pity. He was a victim in this too, she realized, but the thought did little to ease her own anguish. Emily began to feel like she was living in a nightmare, one where every door was locked, every escape route blocked. As the days dragged on, she knew she had to act, but the question loomed. How could she fight against the very people who had given her life? How could she escape a fate her parents had already sealed? The day Emily had dreaded finally arrived, a cold and overcast morning that seemed to mirror her state of mind. She woke early, her heart pounding in her chest as the reality of what lay ahead settled in. Her parents had instructed her to stay in her room until they called for her, and she obeyed, sitting on the edge of her bed and staring blankly at the walls. She felt trapped, as though the walls themselves were closing in on her. There was no escape now. Every attempt she had made to resist had been met with firm, unyielding control. Downstairs, Emily could hear the faint sounds of her parents preparing for the ceremony. The basement was being set up for the event, its usual storage of old furniture and boxes, replaced with makeshift decorations and an altar. The thought of what was about to happen filled Emily with a sense of dread so intense it felt like she could barely breathe. She tried to calm herself, but the weight of the situation was too much to bear. When her mother finally came to her room, she held a white dress in her hands. "It's time," she said simply, her tone devoid of warmth. Emily didn't respond. She stood mechanically, allowing her mother to help her into the dress. It felt suffocating, its fabric heavy and constricting, and Emily fought back tears as her mother brushed her hair and arranged it into a tight braid. As Emily descended the stairs, the reality of the situation became even more unbearable. The basement, dimly lit by flickering candles, was filled with an oppressive silence. A small group of people, distant relatives Emily barely recognized, stood solemnly around the makeshift altar. Her father was at the center of it all, standing beside Ethan, who looked pale and terrified. Emily's heart ached for her brother, but she also felt an inexplicable anger at him. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't tried to stop any of this. The ceremony began with a prayer, spoken in a language Emily didn't understand. Her parents had insisted that this was part of their heritage, but it felt alien and deeply unsettling to her. The officiant, an older man with a stern expression, began reciting vows, instructing Emily and Ethan to repeat after him. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. She couldn't go through with this. She couldn't let this become her reality. Then, just as the officiant reached the point where Emily was supposed to respond, a sudden noise interrupted the proceedings. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and determined, followed by a loud knock at the basement door. Everyone froze, the tension in the room palpable. Before anyone could react, the door burst open. Mrs. Callahan stood there, her face a mix of anger and concern, accompanied by a uniformed police officer. "What's going on here?" the officer demanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Chaos erupted. The officer quickly assessed the scene, his expression turning to one of disbelief as he realized what was happening. John and Sarah Johnson tried to protest, but their words fell on deaf ears. The officer ordered everyone to stay where they were as he called for backup. Emily felt a surge of relief so overwhelming it brought her to her knees. Within minutes, the ceremony was over, not in the way her parents had intended, but in a way that finally brought an end to their control. As her parents were handcuffed and led away, Emily realized that her life had changed forever. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left behind would take a long time to heal. Dust began to settle. The investigation into the Johnson family took on a life of its own. The police were stunned by what they uncovered, and the community of Maplewood was thrown into a whirlwind of shock and disbelief. What had seemed like an ordinary suburban family was now at the center of a deeply unsettling case that captured national attention. Emily and Ethan were taken into protective custody, while their parents, John and Sarah, were held in jail awaiting trial. At first, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The immediate danger was gone, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel trapped. But as investigators began to dig deeper into her family's history, Emily found herself drawn back into the darkness she thought she had escaped. The Johnson family, it turned out, had a legacy far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Investigators uncovered old journals, letters, and documents hidden in the basement and attic of the house. These artifacts painted a chilling picture of a long-standing tradition upheld by certain branches of the Johnson lineage. For generations, this secretive group had believed in preserving their bloodline through arranged marriages between relatives. The practices were justified through a warped interpretation of heritage and tradition, cloaked in secrecy to avoid scrutiny from the outside world. Emily was horrified to learn that her parents had been indoctrinated into this ideology from a young age. John and Sarah's own union had been arranged under similar circumstances, and they had been groomed to carry on the practice without question. To them, their actions weren't just a duty, they were an obligation to the family's legacy. The more Emily learned, the more she realized how deeply rooted the problem was. She discovered that her parents had been in contact with other families who shared their beliefs. These families operated in shadows, communicating through coded letters and private meetings. It was a network of secrecy and manipulation, one that had thrived for decades without detection. As these revelations came to light, Emily's testimony became crucial to the investigation. She had to recount, in painful detail, the months of psychological abuse and coercion she had endured. Ethan, too, was interviewed extensively, though his trauma had left him withdrawn and unable to fully articulate his experiences. The authorities worked tirelessly to piece together the full scope of the network, using the evidence from the Johnson home to track down other families involved in similar practices. The case made headlines across the country, sparking outrage and disbelief. Advocates for child protection and survivors of abuse used the opportunity to call for stronger laws and safeguards against familial exploitation. Emily watched the news coverage from her temporary foster home, feeling a mix of anger and sorrow. Her story had become a symbol of resilience, but it was also a stark reminder of how easily abuse could hide behind the facade of normalcy. Despite the progress being made, Emily couldn't shake the lingering sense of betrayal. The people she had trusted most in the world, her parents, had tried to destroy her future in the name of tradition. She began attending therapy sessions where she slowly unpacked the layers of trauma she had experienced. It was a long, painful process, but Emily was determined to reclaim her life. As the trial date for her parents approached, Emily prepared herself for the next chapter. She knew the scars of her past would always be with her, but she was equally determined to make sure the cycle of abuse ended with her. The Johnson legacy of secrecy and control was over, and Emily vowed to use her voice to help others who might be trapped in similar situations. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. In the months following the trial, life began to take on a different shape for Emily and Ethan. Their parents were sentenced to decades in prison after being convicted of multiple charges, including child abuse, coercion, and conspiracy. The network of families connected to the Johnsons was dismantled as law enforcement uncovered the full extent of their operations. It was a victory in many ways, but for Emily, it was far from an end to the emotional turmoil. Emily was placed in a foster home with a kind and understanding family who encouraged her to focus on her healing. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of her routine as she worked through the trauma that her parents' actions had caused. Ethan was placed with another family nearby, and though they were no longer living under the same roof, the siblings occasionally met under the supervision of their caseworkers. These meetings were often tense, as both struggled to navigate the complexities of their shared pain. One day, while sifting through the belongings that had been salvaged from their childhood home, Emily stumbled upon a sealed envelope tucked into an old jewelry box. It was addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. She hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling as she carefully unfolded the letter. The contents were shocking. The letter was written by her late grandmother and revealed a secret that had been buried for years. Ethan was not her biological brother. He had been adopted by John and Sarah when he was just a baby, after his birth parents, distant relatives of the Johnsons, died in a tragic car accident. The revelation left Emily reeling. Everything she had endured was already incomprehensible, but this new information shifted her perspective in ways she couldn't immediately process. At first, Emily felt a wave of relief. The knowledge that Ethan wasn't her blood relative didn't erase the trauma of what her parents had attempted, but it removed a layer of the horror that had haunted her. However, this relief was quickly followed by guilt. Ethan had grown up believing they were siblings, and she wondered how this revelation might affect him. When she finally shared the news with Ethan during one of their supervised visits, his reaction was quiet but profound. He seemed more confused than anything, struggling to reconcile this new truth with the identity he had always known. Over time, though, the revelation brought the two closer. They were no longer bound by the weight of a forced relationship dictated by their parents' twisted beliefs. Instead, they began to forge a bond on their own terms, united by their shared survival and determination to move forward. Emily channeled her pain into action, speaking out publicly about her experiences. Her story became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about the importance of recognizing and intervening in cases of familial abuse. She worked with advocacy groups to promote awareness, sharing her journey in interviews and at events. Though revisiting her trauma was painful, Emily found purpose in helping others find their voice. Years later, Emily and Ethan met in a sunny park to reflect on how far they had come. Emily was pursuing a degree in psychology, inspired by her therapists and her desire to support others who had faced similar hardships. Ethan was exploring his passions in art, a talent he had discovered during his own healing process. As they sat together, the scars of their past were still present, but they no longer defined them. Their journey was far from over, but they had reclaimed their lives from the shadows of their parents' choices. Together, they were a testament to resilience, proving that even in the face of unimaginable pain, it was possible to build a new future.